Tonight we'll be hearing from Dr. Thomas Sigler on Can Daylight Be Saved? Should Daylight Be Saved? Australian and international perspectives. Thomas is Deputy Head of the School of Environment and Associate Professor of Geography at the University of Queensland. He teaches broadly across urban and economic geography at UQ and is a scientific committee member at RGSQ. His research focuses on diverse topics on urban and economic geography, with recent projects focusing on the financialisation of critical mineral supply chains, global cities networks, Airbnb and short-term rentals, and various studies related to housing and population. He's recently completed a project on daylight savings in collaboration with Wilson Tucker MLC, with focuses on better understanding Australian perspectives on daylight saving. Though he has advocated for daylight saving in Queensland, he personally supports other alternatives to the current time zone regime. Without further ado, we'll throw to Thomas to enlighten us further on this topic.
Done. Thanks everyone for having me. So I'm just starting my stopwatch. Thanks everyone for having me this evening. Can I first of all start by saying I really am pleased to be here at RGSQ, and I really appreciate this organization. I think that it's really important to have a Royal Geographical Society in one's jurisdiction. And oh, you know what? Turn the mic on. It's really important to have a Geographical Society. I really appreciate all the work that all of you put into this society, because I think keeping this alive is really important to the future of geography. And as one of the few geographers at UQ, I do feel committed to the cause, and that's why I'm on the scientific committee, which is why I'm here. So Arafne asked me to give a presentation today. I apologize in advance to Annie and Chris, who've heard much of this before at a forum we held at oh, you weren't there. Oh, okay. To Chris, at least, for some overlaps between what was presented at UQ a few weeks ago and what we'll be presenting today. So as you can probably tell, or you will be able to tell, this is a topic I'm quite passionate about. Unfortunately, it's not one that attracts millions of dollars of funding, and so UQ likes me to study other things. But in my hobby, in my few spare minutes I have, I do study this topic because I find it interesting. And the more I study it, the more interesting I find it. Because at the end of the day, all of us live in some sort of space-time, and all of us fundamentally rely on the clock to tell us when to do things and when not to do things. And that's to a large extent controlled by a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, which is the history of time zones, and then finally the daylight saving debate. So the history of time is basically the history of globalization. Time has been something that human beings have practiced in some form for at least 40 centuries. So 40 millennia, dating back basically to the history of human beings. Human beings rely on time for coordination of activities. We know what time to meet each other. We know what time to work. We know time in different sorts of scales, what time the harvest is on an annual cycle, what time to wake up, what time to go to bed on a daily cycle, and on a multi-annual cycle, there are other indicators of time which are sort of inbuilt in human society and over time have been codified through various systems. So we need timekeeping for coordination activities. In the modern era, it was mainly tied to two things. One was religion, and the other one was social organization. So for religion, if you go to, for example, a city in Europe, you'll find the tallest building is often a bell tower, right? And the bell tower exists because someone rang a bell to let you know what time to pray or what time to come to church. Likewise, in the Muslim world, as we know, the tallest buildings are often minarets, which again, call to prayer at particular times of day. And the coordination of those times is fundamental to making society work. Coordination intensified with the Industrial Revolution. There were two concurrent advances. One was timekeeping and one was time measurement, and they're slightly different things. The one we were mainly concerned with, this is 200 years ago, was time measurement, right? A lot of the innovations in watchmaking and clock making date to the Industrial Revolution when things got a lot more precise, right? We went from being able to measure clock time and to a precision of a couple of minutes to a couple seconds, and finally, we're looking at nanoseconds, and even I don't know what's smaller than a nanosecond, but atomic clocks are very, very precise. Let's put it that way. There's practically no ambiguity with what time it is any given time, and there are multiple global atomic clocks that are ticking at sort of in harmony to codify global time zones. However, there were multiple competing times. So time initially came out of, I guess, what we would today call the Middle East. A lot of the systems that we've established for measurement came out of the Arab world. But ultimately, these systems became Western systems. Things like the sexagesimal hour. So in other words, we have 60 seconds in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes an hour, and so on. And that's a pretty arbitrary standard, right? There's nothing intrinsic about 60. It's just that that was the system that prevailed for various reasons. We also have the Gregorian calendar. There's no intrinsic number. February should have 28 days. But it does because it's the system that's carried over from year to year. So again, already I've got you thinking, why do we have 24 hours in a day? Why do we have why is time kept on a 12-hour cycle that then repeats itself twice in a 24-hour day? There's all these weird things that we've come to just accept about time, and clock time embeds all of that in the system. Now we go to the global regime. So time was largely locally kept until the need to coordinate time across large distances. I'll talk a bit about that in a minute, but what you need to know is that the history of global time coordination is the history of economic globalization. It was about connecting distant places and making sure activities were coordinated between those distant places, especially in the era of simultaneous transactions, so international banking transactions, but even before that, shipments of goods, even before airplane travel, railroad travel, ship travel, we had to coordinate when things arrived. You would have all read the book Around the World in 80 Days as kids, and you know the punchline, of course, is that when he gets around the world, it actually hasn't been 81 days, it's only been 80 days because he's traveled around the world and crossed the international date line. So time was on Jules Verne's mind, it was on a lot of the Romantic and Victorian thinkers' minds, because time was a very important thing for the Industrial Revolution to occur and a very, I guess, important activity to coordinate. So London was chosen as the center of the world. Again, this goes back to Western British imperialism, but by convention in the 1870s, 1880s, Greenwich, which is just outside of London, I'll show you a photo in a second, and the 24 hours in the map emanated from that central point. So there were 12 time zones to the west of London and 12 time zones to the east of London. No reason for that other than the fact that British naval hegemony was so important in the 1860s that it was sort of undisputable that that would be the center of the world and everything else would be sort of secondary to that, at least as far as Western time standards went. And there's Greenwich. If you ever get the chance to visit, you'll note that the actual prime meridian is not on the prime meridian. They got it wrong by a couple meters, and you can look at your phone and walk one direction to the actual prime meridian. But you can see rapid advances in timekeeping, again, largely tied to industrialization. You can see various advances in pendulums, chronometers, quartz clocks, cesium fountains, and so on. And you note that the y-axis on this graph is logarithmic, in that it very quickly advances from 100 seconds to 1 second to milliseconds to nanoseconds to picoseconds and so on. So the advances in timekeeping are rapid, and they have made it such that precision in timekeeping is no longer an issue. We are very certain how long a second is, and there's not really much dispute about that. So timekeeping was essential to the Industrial Revolution for lots of different reasons. First of all, we had to show up for work on time. And so making sure that everyone had some sort of a device to ensure that they could show up for work on time. We also had to make sure that we didn't work too much. So the number of hours in a workday, and a lot of measurement came along with that. We measured the number of widgets that we produced in units, but then increasingly we measured the number of widgets we produced per hour. And outputs and things were all denominated in standardized units of time. X widgets per hour, X cars per hour. In my case, X classes taught, X students taught per hour, per second, per year, and so on. Time zones came about as a result of necessity. So railroads were extended across the United States in the 1840s, 1830s, 1840s. By the 1850s, there were large rail lines across the East Coast, and by the 1860s and 70s, the West Coast was connected as well. This is a pretty large geographic expanse. You'll note that Britain had railroads before this in the 1820s, but Britain's not very big. So east to west, Britain might be a couple hundred miles, whereas the US is about the size of Australia east to west. So as a result, each local train station kept their own time at solar noon, right? And so When you arrived in Louisville, you asked the local train station master what time it was, and you recalibrated your watch. Well, that was okay, except it made it very difficult to coordinate between stops on a lengthy train line. And when trains started traversing the United States, it was very important to coordinate shipments, and it just drove everyone crazy that they didn't have standardized ways to coordinate across time. So they established these things called time zones, right? So the advent of the time zone is the railroad. On the left, you can see a map of the proposed time zones from the Chicago and Elton Railway. On the right, you can see all the different local news. So you can see, for example, I'm supposed to be showing with my pointer, New York, Albany, New York, it was 12:06. New York City, it was 12:04. New Orleans, Louisiana, it was 11 o'clock. Detroit, Michigan, 11:28. That's when the sun was overhead. But of course, that didn't do much for the coordination of activities. So time zones were established first in the United States, and then the system was extended across the Atlantic, and it was agreed upon in the 1880s. So that American time zone system slowly became the global time zone system, and the British and the Americans agreed that they would use a system based in London, but based on this American system of roughly 15 degrees per time zone. So if you do the math, the world is 360 degrees, divide by 24, and you get 15. So each slice would be 15 degrees. And that's what it was meant to be. So each slice was 15. You can see that Greenwich Mean Time kind of lies on the prime meridian, which is that red line in the middle. And that 7.5 degrees east and west of that was contained within what we call GMT. These days, it's known as UTC, Universal Transverse Time, or it's the French acronym. The purple zone to the east of that would be GMT +1. The green zone would then be GMT +2, GMT +3, +4, +5. Get to Brisbane, we're in GMT +10, right? We're always in GMT +10. You probably don't notice that too often, other than when you try to coordinate an activity in your Outlook calendar. You'll see something that says Brisbane/Australia, and it's UTC +10. That's the time zone designation we've been given. That's 10 hours east of London. Now, what happened? Over time, that didn't work for everywhere. You'll notice that China, for example, is entirely brown. That's because Beijing said, we don't like the fact that the west and the eastern parts of the country are on different time zones. We're actually just going to practice one time zone. Thank you very much. Did they have to agree to the system of 24 global time zones? No, they didn't, right? So a lot of countries didn't. India has one time zone. Australia has 3, although geographically it might have 4. The US has 4, although geographically it might have 5. Russia has like 11 in this map. Russia's gone back and forth. It's had as many as 11 and as few as 8. It keeps switching. Various oblasts will go on and off of time zones. There's a lot of different anomalies to this system where the world was carved up into 24 equal times. So already we're seeing a bit of an aberration from the original concept. And it's largely because of politics. So if you're in Eastern China, let's say in Shandong province, the sun never sets after 7:15 p.m. If you're in Western China, the sun never rises before 7:15 a.m. ever, because it's all one time zone, but geographically it's about the size of Australia, right? About 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers east to west. So this is what the global time zone system looks like today. You'll see a number of places that are shaded sort of diagonal. That's a half-hour offset. So these are called UTC offsets. So as I said, our offset is +10. Other ones have Adelaide, or South Australia's offset is +9.5. In the summer, it's +10.5. However, Northern Territory is 9.5 in the summer and 9.5 in the winter. India has a 30-minute offset. Nepal has a 45-minute offset. Eucla in Western Australia, which is right, sorry, I'm not supposed to go there. Eucla is right here on the South Australia border, has a strange 45-minute offset because it's geographically halfway between Adelaide and Perth, but 2.5 hours was too big a jump, so they kind of split the difference, and I think it's 45 minutes ahead of Perth. So we now have 38 UTC offsets and far more TZs, and I'll explain what a TZ is in a second. The time zone that Brisbane is in is UTC +10. You can see UTC +10 is a very large time zone that extends all the way up to northern Russia. I calculated before the lecture today, Vladivostok, which is in the eastern part of Russia, fairly large city, is 1,800 kilometers west of Brisbane. And that's not even the farthest west point in the time zone. So east to west, the time zone is, I don't know, 2,500 kilometers, when in fact it should be far less. I think each time zone should be what's 40,000 divided by 24? About 1,500. So it's far larger than a standard time zone should be. And this is due to gerrymanders. So you've all heard of gerrymanders, those of you who have studied geography before. A gerrymander is a funny way of slipping more constituents into an electorate by redrawing the lines. So I kind of call these time zone boundaries gerrymanders, in that China, for example, has gerrymandered 1.5 billion people into a single time zone, when in fact, if you went back to the original principle of UTC offsets, it should have 3 or 4 east to west, but it doesn't because of political reasons. Some of the more notable gerrymanders in the world, which are the aberrations to this global time zone regime. Indiana is a fascinating one. So it's an American state. It's roughly 200 kilometers east to west, 400 kilometers north. It's not a very big American state. But because of politics, part of Indiana wants to be on Eastern time and part of Indiana wants to be on Central time. And the reason is the northwestern counties in Indiana, Lake, Porter, and LaPorte, are just outside Chicago. So a lot of people from those places commute to Chicago every day. In the Southwest, if we go to Posey County and Gibson County, a lot of those folks commute to Louisville, Kentucky every day. So on the Southwest, they're commuting into Kentucky. On the Northwest, they're commuting into Chicago. But the rest of the state wants to be on Eastern time zone because they want the extra sunlight. So what's happened in Indiana is initially they were all on Central, then half on Eastern, then mostly on Eastern, and then you had some tinkering with individual counties, and they've switched like 15 times. So Indiana has actually devolved it right down to the county level to decide which time zone people want to be on, and it keeps changing to the point where I can't even really keep track of Indiana. But I think the status quo looks something like this, where the counties around Chicago and the counties around Louisville are on Central time, and the rest of the state is on Eastern time. I mentioned TZ a few minutes ago. TZ is the global time zone library. So when you get your phone displays a time. My phone is telling me it's 7:54. My phone does not know it's 7:54. All my phone knows is the time that Vodafone or Telstra tells it. Vodafone or Telstra also doesn't know the time. It gets a signal from an atomic clock, and then it adds a certain number of hours. I'm sure you've woken up in October to find that Queensland magically had daylight savings time. That's because they got the TZ wrong. It happens every now and then where they think it's on New South Wales time. It's happened a few times where Telstra will actually push the wrong time zone to folks in Queensland. Anyway, each part of the world has a TZ. I won't get too far into this. I can tell you about it afterwards because I've just written a whole paper on this. But essentially, this is the best way we have of cataloging these UTC offsets. The reason being, some places like Indiana go on and off time zones so often that once a place establishes a new time zone, even if it goes back to its old time zone, the new time zone is frozen in the data set forever. I'll give you a concrete example from Queensland. There's 2 time zones in Queensland. One is Queensland and one is called Hayman Island time. And the reason is during the last daylight saving trial, which was in 1991, Hayman and Hamilton Island said, we don't want to go back. We want to stay on daylight saving because it's better for tourism. So for 1 extra year, they did daylight saving in 1992, and it got frozen into the database. So even though there's absolutely no difference between the time zone in Brisbane and Hamilton Island, they have their own time zone. If you looked at a really long time zone library of all the different offsets, you'll find Hamilton and Hayman Island have their own time zone, strangely. Norfolk Island has its own time zone. You can see here, Eucla. Anyone would know what this little one is here? Broken Hill. That's right, Broken Hill. So Broken Hill has its own TZ. Why? Because it uses Adelaide time. So Broken Hill is geographically much closer, and in terms of latitude, it's much closer to, in terms of longitude, it's much closer to Adelaide, and therefore it observes UTC plus 9:30 or plus 10:30 in the summer, as opposed to the rest of New South Wales, which is UCC plus 10 / plus 11. Getting a bit technical here. All right, then you've got what I would call UTC bleed. In other words, there are more than 12 each direction. And the reason is that Christmas Island, Kiribati, which is the one sort of in the middle of that gerrymander, wanted to be more aligned with the Western Pacific than the Eastern Pacific. And so some of the islands that belong to the US, that are territories of the US, are actually west of the international date line, but are on the time zone aligned with the eastern side of the line, if that makes sense. So I was on a flight a couple of years ago. I was coming back from visiting my parents in the States, and I flew Fiji Airways because it was the cheapest. So I flew from Los Angeles to Suva and Ornati, and on the way, I actually passed through international time zone boundaries 8 times in the same night. So I left Los Angeles on a Friday. I then crossed the international date line and it became Sunday, but then I crossed it again and it became Saturday, and I crossed it again, it became Sunday, and then I crossed it again and it became Saturday, and I landed in Brisbane on Sunday. So somewhere, if someone had gotten sick on that flight and the pilot had to fill out a report, an incident report, it would have been very, very difficult to figure out what day that incident happened. Because within 20 minutes, you can see we flew over the international date line 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times in one evening. Right? Not to mention, you click over 2 days, not just 1 day when you fly over the international date line. So very, very confusing for an incident report to be filed. Nonetheless, I was proud of Fiji Airways for displaying the real date at each time. It kept switching, and of course, I stayed up all night watching it, being a good geographer. Time zone Australia. So we don't have the simplest system in this country. In fact, we have one of the more difficult ones. So there are 3 primary time zones, that is large, I guess, linear north-south time zones. Currently, of our 6 states, 4 of them observe daylight saving plus ACT. So Tasmania, Victoria, New South Wales, and South Australia do observe daylight saving. ACT does observe daylight saving. Queensland does not. Northern Territory does not. Western Australia does not. However, they have had 4 referenda, and none of them have got up. And they have had Western Australia has had a trial, I think, as recently as 2010. So a much more recent trial than Queensland had, but it still did not get up. So on a December morning, just to give you an idea of how crazy the situation is here in Australia. The sun hits our beautiful shores in Moreton Bay at 4:50 in the morning, which means the curlews and the kookaburras and all the other beautiful creatures start cooing at about, what, 4:15, 4:20? The dogs start barking at about 4:30. Melbourne is lucky. They don't get the sun until 5:50. Adelaide gets the sun at 5:20 because they're actually half an hour ahead of Brisbane, but 2,000 kilometers to the west. Lord Howe Island is east of Brisbane, but it doesn't get sunny until 5:20. Darwin, it gets sunny at 4:20. Perth, it gets sunny at 2:50, right? And at Eucla, it's 3:35 in the morning. So, sorry, to revise that, it's the same time, exactly the same time, but the clock time is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You have 7 different clock times in Australia at exactly the same moment when the sun is hitting the eastern seaboard of Australia. It's hitting Melbourne, it's hitting Brisbane, it's just about to get light in Adelaide, and folks in Perth have 1 or 2 more hours of sleep at that time. Oh, sorry, Chris, don't forget Christmas Island, it's 1:50. On the other side of the day, as the sun is setting, you can see the sun is about to set over Mount Cootha. It is 6:50 on a December afternoon. Melbourne's still got about an hour of daylight, and it's 7:50. Adelaide's got about 2 hours of daylight left, it's 7:20, and so on. So Australia has 10 time zones. If you count Christmas Island, Lord Howe Island, Norfolk Island, Australian Antarctic Territory, Eucla, Broken Hill, and the other 5, right? Maybe that's 11. We have a lot, right? That's for 26 million people. Granted, most people live in 2 or 3 of those, but that is a lot of time zones. The only countries with more time zones are the US and Russia, which there's a reason for it. Alaska's huge. Hawaii is quite a bit farther west than the rest of the mainland. And in Russia, Russia's just really expansive. So Russia really can't help having lots of time zones. All right, so to offset this and to save daylight, which is the crux of my presentation today, there has been a movement the last century to move 1 hour ahead during the summer. So the idea is we simply borrow an hour from the morning when it's not very useful, tack it onto the afternoon when it is useful, and call it a day. I never realized this could be so controversial until I moved to Queensland, right? It was just something I did as a kid growing up in Pennsylvania. I spent a lot of summers outdoors riding my bike. It was sunny, or at least it was light. And you sort of go in at dark and wake up the next morning, sun rises around 7, you don't think too much of it, and you go on with your life. Now I moved to Queensland and the sun rises, as I mentioned, around 4:15 in December. But it sets before 7, and we are the only major city outside the tropics in the world to never see a 7 p.m. sunset. So daylight saving was first implemented as an energy saving measure. The idea way back when was actually to save on candle wax. So Ben Franklin went to Paris back in the 1790s, I think, and observed that the French were doing some informal version. They were calling it summertime, as the French do. They have a cool name for everything. And he observed that they were doing something a little bit different in the summer. They would go to the office an hour earlier, but also leave the office an hour earlier. And it wasn't formally construed as daylight savings, but it was an informal version of daylight savings. And he also observed that they were doing it to save on candle wax because they would complete their evening meal in full daylight, pack up the dishes, kind of get everyone to bed, and then the sun would set and they'd all go to sleep. As opposed to places that hadn't implemented this, even in the summer, they were sort of extending their daily activities into the darkness, and they had to burn candle wax to do it. It was first implemented formally in World War I, so lots of countries, Australia included, started implementing daylight saving in about the 1910s. A lot of countries implemented it during World War I, dropped it, came back to it during World War II, and then permanently implemented it from the 1950s and 60s onward. I think Australia has been since the 60s or 70s. Daylight saving is currently observed in about 70 countries, which is about a third of the world's countries. The vast majority of those are in Europe. So of the 50 countries that observe daylight saving, I think about 50 are in Europe. There's only 2 countries in Europe that don't observe daylight saving, and that's Russia and Belarus. And it's in constant change. Countries go on, countries go off. There was a really interesting article in the paper the other day about Brazil. So Brazil implemented it a few years ago, and then they got rid of it. And then now people want it back. Ukraine, I'll tell you about the Ukraine later. That's a really interesting case, which was not motivated by daylight, but by politics. So to give you an idea of where I think daylight saving is useful, and of course it's very subjective, it's not very useful in the tropics. In fact, it's not at all useful in the tropics because the daylight doesn't vary. So in Singapore, for example, Singapore has 12 hours of daylight, no matter how you slice it. Doesn't matter if it's September, October, January, March, it's always 12 hours of daylight, maybe a little bit of variation because Singapore is 3 degrees off the equator. Likewise in Cairns, right? Cairns is about 15 degrees off, I think 15 degrees south. It's not too, there's a little bit of variation. I think the winter days are about 11 hours long, the summer hours are about 13 hours long. Where it starts to get useful, and this is why it's such an interesting debate here in Queensland, is about 25 degrees. Right now, Brisbane's at 27, so it's just in that zone where I would say yes, it is useful. And then it's not very useful above about 55, because you're talking about northern Norway, northern Alaska, Patagonia, places that are pretty far away from the equator. And in those areas, you have so much daylight in the summer that who cares when it's light, right? In northern Norway, it's light from 2 a.m. to midnight. Does it really matter if it's light from 2 a.m. to midnight or 3 a.m. to, right? I mean, it's just constantly light. The sun barely sets in most of Norway, and in northern Norway, it doesn't set at all. Likewise, in the winter, it's dark all the time. So playing with the clock isn't going to do much difference. So I would say that Goldilocks zone where daylight saving really does have an impact is from about 20-25 north or south, to about 50 north or south. Once you get north of about Berlin or north of Hamburg, it starts to matter a lot less. And that's why a lot of the movements in Europe to get rid of it are from the north of Europe. That doesn't see much point. And you can see how the daytime varies quite a bit. So this is the course of the year. You have Christmas on the left and Christmas on the right. And in between, so the purple line is 60 degrees latitude. You can see that in the middle of the year, they have about 19 hours of daylight. And around Christmas, they have about 4 hours of daylight. So where you want to be for daylight saving to really matter is somewhere between 20 and 40 degrees, where the variation between summer and winter time is somewhere between about 4 and 8 hours, right? Because if it's 16-hour variation, it doesn't matter. If it's a 0-hour variation, it also doesn't matter. Southern hemisphere is exactly the opposite. As I said, here in Brisbane, we're about here. We're at 28 degrees south. So you can see our summer days, I just flipped the thing. Our summer days are 13 hours and 45 minutes long. Our shortest winter day, which is in about a month, will be about 11 hours, about 10 hours and 45 minutes. So depending on if you count the oblique sun at the beginning and end of the day. We don't have much of a twilight here either because we're in the subtropics. For those of you that have been to the UK, you'll know the days are very short. In the wintertime and very long in the summer, usually around Christmas time, it gets very dark. There's something kind of nice about it, actually, about it just being dark that particular time of year. It also gets light really quickly again in January and February. So you kind of inside hold up for the Christmas period and New Year's, and then February comes along and the days start getting longer again. Likewise, in Norway, the sun, this is different hours of the day. The sun literally never sets in northern Norway. For those of you that have been to Sweden or Norway or northern Russia or Alaska in the summertime, you'll know that it gets darker, but it never gets entirely dark. So the daylight saving debate is completely moot. All right, moving on. So whose crazy idea was it anyway? I did mention that Ben Franklin observed daylight saving, and he is widely credited with daylight saving. That is incorrect. It was, interestingly, it was someone here in the Antipodes that came up with it. A guy named George Hudson, who was an entomologist in New Zealand. And he wanted to go out and collect bugs in the afternoons. So in the 1890s, he really flogged it and finally convinced the New Zealand government to implement it. The champion in the other side of the world was a guy named William Willett. William Willett never actually lived to see daylight saving implemented. I think he died around 1910, and it was implemented, as I mentioned, during the First World War, about 5 years after he died. But he wrote a treatise on it. He wrote that book called A Waste of Daylight, and he was there you can March 1914. So you can see that it was published just before it was implemented in the UK. And his argument is, why are we wasting daylight, guys? Like, what's the point in 4 a.m. daylight or even 3 a.m. daylight if we can have daylight at 9 or 10 p.m. When it's a bit more useful? Again, in the UK, it's a bit marginal because they're so far north, but many places on Earth, it is very useful. This is a profile of the year. So again, January to December, you can see this is a Northern Hemisphere location. You can see it gets quite light. The different bands are actually different forms of twilight. So you have civil twilight, nautical twilight, astronomical twilight, and official daylight, which is only really important if you're a scientist or filling out a police report for a traffic accident or something like that. But you can see that this must be somewhere really far north because it never quite gets dark in June, July. Right. Then you've got a profile of somewhere like this, where it's kind of steady. This would be Singapore, where it kind of varies, but never really changes much throughout the year. This would be a place, this is what daylight saving does. So daylight saving is just kind of shifts part of the year. This would be somewhere in the Northern Hemisphere. I'm guessing somewhere like New York, where you would have quite a bit of variation between summer and winter, and you offset it by shifting it for daylight saving. Here, this is another one. And this is Brisbane. So this is what Brisbane looks like. You can see it gets a bit fatter in December, January, and February in the summer, and then gets a bit thinner. But there's not a huge amount of variation, but I think just enough to matter probably. All right, so who observed daylight saving? As I said, about 70 countries around the world. However, many countries have experimented with it, including Russia, China, Mongolia, other large countries have tried it. They haven't necessarily adopted it for various reasons. They've gone back to observing standard time year-round, or they've recalibrated their standard time. In the case of Russia, as I mentioned, the case of Russia was actually political. Moscow wanted to be on the same time as the rest of, not the same time, but the same day as the rest of Russia. The idea was if there's 10 time zones in Russia, by the time bureaucrats in Moscow get to work, the folks in Vladivostok have already gone home for the day. But if they truncate the number of time zones to 7 or 8, which I think they have right now, it means that when the Muscovites get to work, the people in the office in the east are still at work, so they can ring them up and still do a bit of business with each other east to west. So that was a politically motivated daylight saving. Ukraine's even more interesting. I'll explain that one in a minute. So these are the current countries that observe daylight saving. I think this is even a few years old because it still includes southern Brazil. I think Brazil's gotten rid of it. Egypt has gone on daylight saving, so Egypt would be added to this. Chile, I think, has gone off it, although I need to double check that one, and Lebanon has gone off it. So those are kind of the latest movements in the daylight saving cauldron. People have made some really interesting maps about daylight saving. This is a geographical talk, so I figured I should include some maps. This shows you how beneficial daylight saving is. So you want to be sort of yellow, orange, red. You don't want to be pink, and you definitely don't want to be blue. So for example, in the Congo, the Western Congo really could be in a different time zone. The good news is not many people live in that part of the Congo, and having lived in the Congo, I can tell you the people that do don't care too much about time. You can see Borneo probably is in the right time zone. Irian Jaya isn't in the right time zone, but largely speaking, most countries in the world are sort of in that sort of red-orange zone. We're in the pink here in Queensland, which means the sun sets at 6 something, which for the tropical parts of Queensland, that's suitable. For the non-tropical parts of Queensland, I would argue it could be a bit later. There's actually a tool if you go online, a guy named Andy Woodruff. I've asked him to do this for Australia, although I didn't have time to do it. There's actually a tool you can play with that shows you can choose what you think is a reasonable time zone a time for the sun to set. So you can say, I don't really want to see the sun before 6 a.m. or I don't really want to see the sun after 6 p.m. And you can put the parameters in yourself and it'll produce, I can send you the link afterwards. It'll produce a really nice map for you based on what your optimal time zone settings would be. And you can say how many days of the year based on these parameters does the sunset say before 7 a.m. or 7 a.m. or before. You can see in Western Ohio, the answer is close to 0. In fact, I was in Western Ohio a few weeks ago, driving across the US, and I slept at a motel and I woke up and it was 7:45 in the morning and still dark. And my brain was so like Queenslandified that I didn't believe it. I was like, there's no way my clock is right. 7:45, it's still dark. This is crazy. But it was right. It was true because they just switched to daylight saving, which means they just borrowed that morning hour, chucked it onto the afternoon. So it was just at the beginning of the daylight saving period of the year. There are some interesting anomalies. Won't get too far into these. Arizona is a really interesting one. So Arizona does not observe daylight saving unless you happen to be Navajo. If you are Navajo, then a lot of your brothers and sisters live over in New Mexico, and you want to be in the same time zone as them. So there's literally a time zone inside of a time zone inside of a time zone in northeastern Arizona, where the Navajo are fully contained within the Hopi Nation, who are fully contained within the Navajo Nation. Now that's kind of unremarkable, other than the fact that the Navajo do daylight saving and the Hopi don't. So I was actually I had to see this place, so I went there a couple of years ago. I took that photo that was at my hotel, and they have 2 different times on the wall. And depending on whether you're on the left side of the street or the right side of the street, they're both Native American reservations. One side of the street is Navajo, one side of the street is Hopi, and it's 2 different times, both in Arizona. There's some other interesting divisions. Australia is an interesting one. Mexico is a really interesting one. Mexico, for commercial reasons, the areas of Sonora and Chihuahua that are on the American border observe daylight saving. The rest of Mexico doesn't, because it doesn't make sense for cities on the Texas and Arizona border to not observe the same time as Texas and Arizona, because there's a lot of commuting and cross-border traffic. But the remainder of Mexico extends into the tropics, and the remainder of Mexico does not have daylight saving. Lebanon, it depends on your ethnicity. So depending on what part of the country, and you can even see that there's places where GMT +1 and GMT +2 coexist. Part of Lebanon is on Jordan time, part of Lebanon is on Israeli time. Interestingly, in the TZ database, because I've done some work with it, Israel time is known as Zion time. And that's, I think, because the authors didn't want to make a judgment about what Israel is. They just said, if you're Israeli and you think it's this time, we're going to call that Zion time. And if you think it's Jordanian time, that's another time. They sort of didn't want to get into the political debate of Israel versus Palestine. It'll be really interesting. I've just seen the headline today that Israel wants to completely resume the Gaza Strip. It'll be interesting to see what time is it in Gaza, because oftentimes Palestinians follow Jordan time, not Israel time. I told you I'd tell you about the Ukrainian case. This is a very recent case. The Ukrainian parliament voted to abolish daylight saving, and they did it not for time reasons or for sun reasons, but for political reasons. The main reason they didn't want to be on the same time as Moscow. So for Ukrainian voters, it was worth the sun rising and setting a bit earlier and not optimizing their daylight, so to speak, to not be on Moscow time. Because for them, everything that they do that's Russian is a victory for Russia. And so the Ukrainian, and what I did is that's a map I made based on Ukrainian parliament data. And I looked at the different political parties, and the pro-Europe parties were very heavily in favor of yes. And the pro-Russian parties, which are on the right side, were very heavily in favor of staying on Moscow time. And you can see how the parliament voted there. The different seats are the different colors. So the different parties are the different colors. So that's Zelensky's party is the green one. And the dot indicates a yes vote. So you can see almost all of Zelensky's party voted to get rid of daylight saving because they were anti-Russia. Whereas the more minority parties or the anti-Europe parties voted more to stay on GMT +3-4. There's some new logics for and against daylight saving. So I guess a lot of people know I'm interested in this topic, as you can tell, and they'll say, well, can't you just get up earlier? Can't you work anywhere? And like you can in theory, but Kohl's is still going to open when Kohl's open. Schools are still going to open when schools open. The bottle is going to open when like things in society are actually programmed. So if we could abolish time in terms of the ability of society to control when things open and close and just make it a complete free-for-all, I would say, sure, that's a great idea. But the unfortunate reality is school starts when school starts. And most traffic and activities in Brisbane are coordinated around the school day and the work day. Another argument for or against daylight saving, depending on where you are in the world, is the uptake of solar energy. So solar energy is most functional when the sun is shining, right? So if we're doing activities like we are right now in the dark, we have to be drawing on grid energy or wind energy, but not solar energy, right? Solar energy only works when the sun is shining, which means we need to adjust our activities to be aligned with the sun. Now, either we can adjust our activities or we can adjust the clock. And we also do things more often in the evening than we used to. This lecture probably wouldn't have worked at 5 a.m., right? Some of you may be early birds, but many of you probably wouldn't have turned up at 5 a.m. It also wouldn't have worked at 9 a.m., not because you're not awake at 9 a.m., but because we have to go to work at 9 a.m. So there's a lot of reasons why this lecture was at 7 p.m., right? Whether we think that's too late or too early or whatever, it just is what it is because of how society is structured and how daily activities are structured. So there you can see energy created by the sun, of course, peaks at solar noon, and in fact, it might peak before solar noon, depending on cloud cover. And human activity is not aligned to that. You can see human activity actually peaks around 7 p.m. when we're eating dinner. We have the lights on, the fridge on, the air conditioner on, the stove on, the washing machine on, and so on. Now, to get to the fun part, the Queensland debate. I've got about 5 minutes left. I'm just going to assume most of you are familiar. In fact, I'm going to assume most of you are more familiar with the Queensland debate than I am, because I'm assuming most of you have lived in Queensland. I've lived here 13 years. I'm assuming most of you have lived here longer than 13 years. So Queensland is a state of superlatives. We are literally the earliest risers on planet Earth. That has been taken from data from Strava. There's the app people have on their watch for running. Sometimes there's a opportunity to capture some spatial data, and we know what time you wake up because that's the time your watch starts shaking. You wake up in the morning, you put your watch on, you start your day. We wake up earlier and go to bed earlier than any city on planet Earth. Like, we have the absolute superlative, and it is one of the few major cities on Earth where it's always dark at 7 p.m. Never light at 7 p.m. We might have a little bit of oblique sun in December. The current Queensland government is not addressing it. And there are multiple solutions, not just daylight saving, and I'll go over those. I'll probably speed through them pretty quickly because you're familiar with the debate. But just to give you an idea of how different Queensland is. And it's not just Queensland, it's mainly Southeast Queensland, it's Brisbane. This is the equinox, right? Equinox, by definition, in Latin, Greek, whatever, means equal nights, right? Equal amount of daylight before and after. So everywhere on Earth has 12 hours of sun that day. In Brisbane, on the equinox, the sun rises at 5:50 and sets at 5:50. Everywhere else on the world, it's rises and sets around 7 p.m., right? Because everywhere else in the world, even Singapore, which is on the equator, has said, 7's probably a little more reasonable time for the sun to rise and set than 5 is. This is actually from my data. So people might say, oh, but Queenslanders are early risers. Yes, but not everyone. So this is actual data from my survey. And this is what I'd call social noon. So each dot represents the middle of a person's day. So if you wake up at 6 a.m. and go to bed at 6 p.m., which no one actually does, the middle of your day is 12. So an average person, let's say an average Queenslander, wakes up at 6 and goes to bed at 9. That means the average that means they're awake for 15 hours that day. That means the middle of their day is 1:30. Well, it turns out the middle of our day is nowhere close to 1:30. For the average Australian, the middle of their day is about 2:15, and even the average Queenslander, the middle of their day is 2. So people tell me, oh, Queenslanders are early risers. It is true to a degree, and you can see that Queensland's probably shifted a bit farther left than other states, but on average, social noon is about 2 p.m., which means in a perfect world, the sun is shining for a few hours before 2 p.m. and a few hours after 2 p.m. This is the current state of play at 7 p.m. Maybe by now it's a little bit darker in Perth and Hobart, for example. This is the number, actually, I have my first year students do this. This is the number of after work daylight hours in different cities around the world at different points in the year. Oh, shoot. I need to navigate back to the, oh well, you get the idea. The idea is that Brisbane for those people that finish work at 5 and get home at say 5:30 or 5:45, you have 1 hour of daylight after work in the summer and 0 hours of daylight in this autumn, spring, and winter. In Melbourne, you would get about 3 hours in the summer after work. This is February. And in Oslo, you'd get about 8, right? Because the sun's up until about midnight. All right. Oh, there it is. There it goes. Longyearbyen, for those of you, anyone know where that is, by the way? Spitsbergen. All right. Excellent. It is in northern Norway, north of northern Norway. Anyway, so we've had a daylight saving referendum here in Queensland. For those of you, raise your hand if you were here for it. Yeah, so more than half of you were here for it. So you do remember it. There were cases mounted by both sides. Ultimately, it didn't get up, 55% no, 45% yes. The reason it didn't get up was manyfold. A lot of people just didn't feel like we needed it. The population of the state was quite a bit different 30 years ago. The population of the state was quite a bit more regional, quite a bit farther north and farther west. The state's population had consolidated in the southeast ever since. And you can see the results. So that yes votes were 744,000, the no votes were 900,000. And the only places that voted for it were effectively Southeast Queensland. So you had Brisbane, the Gold Coast, very strongly in favor, and the rest of the state not in favor at all. All right, so I'll kind of breeze through these because you are familiar with the debate and I'm running out of time. But essentially there's pros and cons on both sides. Those against it think the sun rises and sets late enough. They think it's disruptive to health, and there have been some studies that have shown that. Typically what my research finds, and I have done research on this, is that white collar workers prefer daylight saving, retirees and blue collar workers don't. There's a very simple explanation for that. If you're retired, you have all day to see the sun. If you have a white collar job, you're in the office most of the day, and you only have the beginning and the end of the day to see the sun. Blue collar workers are often against daylight saving because they're in the sun all bloody day, so they see it all day long. So if you're a roofer or a concreter, you could really care less what time the sun shines because you're seeing the sun all day long. There are different options. So one of the things I suggest when I talk about this topic is that it's not just daylight saving or not daylight saving. Those are by far not the only two options. There are many other potential options on the table to solve what I would call an issue. Some people don't think there's an issue. I do. One is greater alignment with daylight saving. Another one is permanent daylight saving. So to push Queensland forward either half an hour or an hour year round. The advantage to that is that we don't have to fiddle with the clocks, so the clock just stays forward. The disadvantages to that is that we do have significantly later winter sunrises. So right now, our latest winter sunrise is 6:36 here in Brisbane. If we moved permanently forward half an hour, it'd be 7:06. If we moved permanently forward an hour, it would be 7:36. Who thinks 7:36 is too late for the sun to rise? Most of you. Okay, right. So those aren't going to work. Hybrid solutions. 30-minute solutions. So this is exactly what South Australia did. So South Australia said, look, we don't want to be GMT plus 10, but we're kind of sick of being GMT plus 9. So let's split the difference. So Northern Territory and South Australia did exactly that. They pushed 30 minutes forward, partly to be closer to Sydney and Melbourne for business reasons. And they're permanently on GMT plus 9:30. And in the summer, they're on GMT plus 10:30, which is a bit weird because they're 2,000 kilometers west of us. Another one, which has been proposed by two Johns Hopkins professors, is to get rid of time zones entirely. And personally, I really like this one. This is an extreme libertarian approach. This is saying we do live in a post-industrial society. We have atomic clocks. So the idea here is that the entire world runs on London time. There's only one time, and that time is London time. It would solve so many headaches with aviation, with coordinating calls. And it would at first it'd be a bit weird, right? Because we would wake up at, we'd wake up at say 6 a.m. here, which would be 10 p.m. in London. So we would wake up at 22 or 21, which is a weird thing to think about, waking up at 21, which is 9 o'clock at night. It's 9 o'clock at night in London, but it's 6 a.m. in Queensland. And so it would take some getting used to, but I actually think it could work. And the benefit to that was that each school and each shop could then pick their own hours. They're saying, okay, well, we have kids in a catchment that come in from far away. We need that extra 30 minutes for transportation. Or, you know what, we're in Western Queensland. The sunrise is pretty early here. Let's actually start work at the equivalent of 5:30 or even 4:30. So you could actually set those adjustments extremely locally. Now, is this likely to happen? No way. There's no way, short of a solar flare or something really disruptive to the global economy or time zone, this will never happen. But personally, I think it would solve a lot of headaches. There's been support from both sides of the political spectrum. One of the findings from my research is that this is not a left or a right issue. Interestingly, the only party that outwardly support it are the Queensland Greens. The Queensland Greens have not done anything about it. However, my research also finds that Liberal voters, so LNP voters, are more in favor of it than left or Labor or Green voters. So go figure. There's also a bit of resistance from not just the right, but Bobby Katter and Rob Katter and some of his mates. They really don't want daylight saving, which makes sense. But Rob Katter's based in Mount Isa. His dad's based in Townsville or somewhere up there. And for them, it doesn't make sense. They're in the tropics. People rise with the sun regardless. A lot of their constituents are farmers. And they're also quite a bit farther west than we are here in Queensland. In fact, they don't want it to the point where they felt the need to circle my face on their, and some guy from America keeps telling us we need daylight savings. And so Robbie Katter has decided to slander me. So support for daylight saving across Australia varies by state. You can see Queensland has some of the lower supportership, but it is still greater than 50%. So people always ask me, if we had another referendum, do I think it would get up? And I do absolutely think it would get up. In Western Australia, my research also shows that there was positive support, overwhelming support in the southern states, which have it. And so every time the debate comes up, should we get rid of daylight saving? I'm like, well, people actually like it. Like, it's annoying. There are lots of, there's a lot of nuisance around switching the time and coordinating with other jurisdictions, because the time change is slightly different to the time change in Europe and the US. But at the end of the day, people like it. I also have shown that different occupations have different attitudes toward it. As I mentioned, tradies and laborers definitely have the lowest perception of daylight savings, again, largely because they are outside. Also, those are the types of occupations that tend to start very early in the morning. It's not uncommon for a tradie to be on site at 5:30 or 6, which means if they go home after 8 hours, they still have 4 hours of daylight. Teachers, for example, who are considered professionals, can't really show up at work at 5 a.m. The students aren't there. They need to show up at work at 8 or whenever the students arrive, and then they kind of have to stay till 4 till the students have left. So if they stay at work at 4 and they get home at 5, they only really get an hour of daylight in the afternoon. So obviously teachers are more for it than tradies are. I just have some graphs here. I can send these later about support. Typically, more educated white collar workers are for it, less educated blue collar workers against it. There's some age-based statistics, and there's also some geography-based. The farther south and the further east you are, the more likely you are to support daylight savings. These are just some very nerdy statistics from my publications with p-values and things that probably don't interest you at 8 o'clock in the evening. All right, and that's what a map looks like. So in terms of support, you can see strong support clustered in the southeast, less support as you go north, and Brisbane's kind of the dividing line. And this is what makes the daylight saving debate so interesting in Queensland, is that we're one of those places where you can make a really strong case against or a really strong case for, and both of you would be right. Because we're right on that dividing line where a lot of people feel strongly in both directions. Now, what other places around the world have debated this? Turns out quite a few. So they had a referendum in Alberta, Canada, a couple years ago. The debate was not whether to go on daylight saving, it was whether to go off daylight saving onto permanent daylight saving. It didn't get up, largely because they didn't want to see 8 a.m. sunrises. Canada's quite a bit farther north than most of Australia, about 52, 54 degrees in Calgary and Edmonton. And so people felt that 8 a.m. was too late for a sunrise, which is fair enough. Many parts of Europe have initiated discussions to recalibrate Europe's time zones. If you've been to Spain, especially Western Spain, you'll know that in the summer, the sun doesn't set till about 10:45 in the evening. And then even in the winter, the sun still sets around 6 or 7 in Spain. It's really far west, arguably in the wrong time zone. But for political reasons, Europe wants to be in the same time zone. So save Portugal, Ireland, and the UK, they are. Number of different arguments for and against. I won't go into the details of each, but basically you've got a proposal for daylight saving, permanent daylight saving, which is just pushing forward an hour, permanent standard time, which is dropping back an hour and eliminating time zones entirely. You've got pros and cons to each. To be fair, I did want to introduce some cons. So Oliver's a colleague of mine at UQ. He studies daylight saving from a sleep psychology and a sort of a sleep biology perspective. And his perspective is that we shouldn't have daylight saving. He thinks it has an increased risk of heart attack, disrupts biological rhythms, mood and mental effects, impacts on pregnancy, and the effects vary by chronotype. What that means is that different people experience it differently. You might have heard the term night owl or early bird. That's a chronotype. So each of us are sort of wired a certain way. Some people just cannot get to sleep early. Some people cannot wake up late. Like, just depends on your biology, and that different people experience daylight saving and time zones different ways. To conclude, I think one of the most interesting recent things that's happened is the crazy president across the Pacific has decided that he wants to get rid of daylight saving. Now, I'm not convinced he knows what he was really saying. And what do I mean by that? He hasn't really specified whether he wants to go permanently forward an hour or permanently stay on standard time. He just said, let's get rid of it. Okay, well, what do you want to do about it? Well, he tapped his right-hand man, Mr. Elon Musk, and Elon Musk then tweeted, all right, guys, what do you want to do? Do you want to go forward an hour? And what do you think happened? Deadlock, 58-42. Exactly the same results when we poll Queenslanders. 58% want, 58 to 60% want daylight saving, 40 to 42% don't, right? Almost always the same result. So interestingly, and keep in mind, Americans live at many different latitudes. In Florida, of course, you have roughly similar day lengths between summer and winter. And of course, in Maine and Seattle, you would have relatively larger variation. But nonetheless, the interesting thing about this is, you can see the date, this was only 2 months ago, Americans cannot decide. So now Trump's got to be like, well, what do I actually do? If I push us forward an hour, I'm angering 42% of the country. If I stay on daylight saving, if I stay on standard time, I'm angering 58% of the country. And if I don't do anything at all, I've broken a campaign promise. So it's a really interesting case that I will be very curious to see how it plays out. And I'm convinced that he won't be able to solve it. There are campaigns against daylight saving and permanent standard. There's one called Safe Standard Time, who sometimes annoys me with emails saying we should stay on standard time year round because it's better for your health. Again, there's a bunch of different solutions. Here in Queensland, I think there's a number of different solutions that don't involve daylight saving statewide. One of them is status quo, which is what we're doing right now. One of them is pushing forward an hour, but not necessarily for the whole state. So you could just sort of break off the Southeast because the rest of the state mostly doesn't want it, although some folks on the coast, like Whitsundays and Cairns, do for tourism reasons. There have been various proposals. So the one on the right is from a group called Daylight Saving for Southeast Queensland. They've decided that the LGAs roughly from Warwick to Bundaberg need daylight saving. There's a guy named Graham Brittenden who actually spoke at our forum a couple months ago at UQ, who lives on Bribie Island. And he's been thinking at the proposal on the left, and he's been on ABC, Channel 7, flogging the one on the left, which is he thinks Australia should have 3 time zones, but that instead of being on GMT plus 10, we should be on GMT plus 10.5 year round. And he would put the entire eastern seaboard of Australia on GMT plus 10.5 and not do daylight saving. So just do year round Graham time. And that's why I want daylight saving. I love to take my daughter to the pool in the afternoons. And when I get home from work, it's dark. So to conclude, the majority of people are not satisfied with the status quo. That's what my research has shown. Whether we need daylight saving or not is up for debate. I'm not saying it's the solution, but it's a solution, and it seems to work down south. Younger populations typically want daylight saving, particularly those who wake up later. Employed populations often want daylight saving, particularly those who work indoors. The southeast corner overwhelmingly wants daylight saving over the north and the west of the state, and there's no perfect solution. So some compromise is going to be needed, which is precisely why no politician will touch this with a 10-foot pole, because they do not want to anger half of their constituents. Like even David Crisafulli, who ostensibly represents the Gold Coast, which is the single biggest beneficiary because of cross-border trade with Tweed in northern New South Wales, he will not touch it. Laura Gerber won't touch it. None of the Gold Coast councillors will touch it. Sorry, Gold Coast MPs will touch it because they just do not want to get involved. In fact, I've asked many of them, and they've been trained to say, oh, that's not on the election. That's not on the agenda this year. We're not going to discuss that. They do not want to talk about it. My view, abolish time zones. If we could, just get rid of them entirely. Let's move to a libertarian system where everyone can set their own time. But in the absence of that, I would push forward. This is my, so I wear three different hats. I wear my hat as me, the person, the citizen, the voter. I wear my hat as me, the academic, and then I also wear my hat as me, the advocate. But I do advocate for daylight saving because I think it's the best, worst solution. But as a person, I would just personally push forward because I'm not a morning person, but I realize that makes me weird. Most of you want to see the sun at 7. I could care less. And as an advocate, I do think it's the best compromise solution. But that said, Queensland is very small. There's a large global debate raging. There's a debate in the US, there's a debate in Europe, there's a debate all over the world, places like Lebanon, Chile, Brazil, Egypt that go on and off of daylight saving. And so I think my gut feeling is that something bigger than us will happen, and Australia's time zones will have to recalibrate to a new global regime in the next decade or two, but I could be wrong. All right, that's it. I've got a bit over time, but thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Thomas. Very fascinating, and now worried about database dates and times I've got stored. Does anyone have any questions for Thomas at this time?
Yes.
Look, I've got a map here, and it appears like most countries of the world have their standard time as if they're on summertime, like they're an hour different to what they should be compared with their longitude.
Yeah, that's yeah, I'd say that's true. So what you're talking about is almost like a natural daylight saving.
Have organized themselves, so in fact they're on summertime all the time.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah.
I mean, the central meridian, in theory, the principle of the time zone system was that the central meridian would run right through the middle of each time zone. But in practice, a lot of places see it as advantageous to be west of that line, not east of that line. Right here in Queensland, here in SEQ, we're 3 degrees east of that line because our central meridian is 150 and we're at 153 east. Right? The time zone regime works perfectly if you're at Charlottesville.
Yeah.
But we're not in Charlottesville.
Yeah.
You showed a chart of energy consumption and solar of like Queensland summertime. Has there been any modeling to show how that might change?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would love to study that myself. I don't know that there has. I mean, there have been some studies, I think, in the US that have modeled the impacts of daylight saving, but I think in the pre-solar era, I mean, it's really only the last 3-4 years that large grid scale solar has been rolled out. So
I just speculate, will it make a difference to our energy consumption if we've got that extra hour of sunlight where we're all kind of pulled our baking boxes for hours?
Yeah, and to be fair, I think some of the research I have read is pretty inconclusive in that, like, we flick the lights on earlier, but we keep the aircon on longer. So it kind of goes both ways. Yeah, but I mean, also we're assuming right now only 5% of our energy is produced by solar. In some distant future, it might be 50 or even 80. So at that point, it will matter. I always go to Bunnings and see the little thing that shows me how much energy is coming off the roof. Other questions? Yep.
You talked about time as a 24-hour continuum, but time also applies to calendars and dates, and indeed what we have what used to be BC and is now before the Common Era. Are there any anomalies around that and discussions and debates? Because if you go to Islamic country or a Buddhist one, they have completely different.
Sure.
dates.
I mean, Y2K is a perfect example. But yeah, I mean, the leap year concept. So actually I glossed over it, but there's 2 guys I mentioned at Johns Hopkins. Their names are Stephen Henry and Richard Hankey. They actually propose a whole revamp of everything. So they propose to get rid of the Gregorian calendar, that every month has 30 days, and they propose to redo how time is done. So yes, they have looked at that. I guess it comes down to tradition and path deviation. Like, at what point does someone say, okay, we're going to stop making February 28 days? Like this year, next year? Like, at what point does February need to be 30 days? Would it actually benefit our lives for it to be 30 days? I think it would have to be a compelling case, right, for it not to have 28 days.
So they're still live issues.
They're live issues, and again, it's not an issue till it's an issue. Like Y2K is a good example, because Y2K was predicted to be this apocalyptic thing that never ended up happening. But people were really scared of Y2K. Like, you all remember Y2K, right? I mean, like, armies of computer programmers were deployed to mitigate the impacts of Y2K, and in the end, nothing happened. But it could be something like that we haven't foreseen, where like all the world's computers are marching towards some date that, I mean, as I said, I think it'll be a solar flare or something completely like almost like extraterrestrial that'll knock the current system out of its orbit, for lack of a better word. Yeah, I don't see the path deviating anytime soon, put it that way. I think Trump will try to tinker with it. I don't think it'll work, but I think something somewhere will knock the global time zone regime off balance, and from there it'll recalibrate. Because it's just, there's too many UTC offsets. There's 38 of them. There were never supposed to be more than 24.
I do have one more if I'm allowed. Do you think we'll have daylight savings just?
No, in fact, Adrian Schrinner called me into his office the other day and asked me if I thought it was a good idea, and I told him no. Because the Olympics is in August, September, so it's not the right time for it. Like if they did the Olympics during the September, October school holidays, maybe, but if they're going to do it in August, September, it's just not. It's not the right timing for it. It would. What I told him is it would make a mockery of it. Yeah. Funny anecdote. You know who Adrian Schrinner is, right? The mayor of Brisbane. Funny anecdote. And he told me I was allowed to say this. He actually thought about tampering with the clock on City Hall just as a publicity stunt to move it forward an hour, just to see if people would notice. But the clock on City Hall is so old that it requires like a specialized clock technician who costs like $10,000 an hour. And it would have cost the council like $100,000 to do. So he figured the bad publicity outweighed the good publicity. So he didn't end up doing it, but he actually genuinely thought about moving the clock on City Hall just as a publicity stunt. Because as you know, Adrian Schrinner is a big advocate of daylight saving. Yeah.
That was my question. You had a clock come up every so often. Was that one from the City Hall?
I don't know which specific clock that was, but yeah, I mean, it kind of, if you ask anyone to show you what a clock looks like, they almost always draw something with like, a minute hand and an hour hand. But at the end of the day, almost all clocks are digital. So almost everything is calibrated centrally from an atomic clock that's in Canberra or Washington or Berlin or something.
We had one question online as well. I noticed that pop up a second ago.
One question online. An army of programmers fix the Y2K bugs. It's called planning. Yes. Thank you, Carrie, for pointing that out.
Perfect. If we don't have any further questions, we might wrap it there. For those online, thank you for joining us. Have a fantastic night. And for those in person, we have some small refreshments for you at the back of the room. Once again, thank you, Thomas. Fascinating presentation. And we'll see everyone again very soon for another RGSQ event.